I'm Chloe, 32 years old, and after 10 years of working 3 jobs, skipping holidays, and saving every penny, I finally bought a small house of my own. I thought I was free from the control, the judgment, the suffocating grip of my parents. So I sent them a simple photo of the house, hoping maybe we could start fresh. 3 days later, my brother called, not to congratulate me, but to demand I show up for dinner. That Sunday, as I sat at their dining table, my father leaned in and said, "You owe this family $95,000, and you're going to sell that house to pay it." I didn't know it yet, but that night would be the start of a legal war against my own blood. Before I dive into the full story, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you've ever been blindsided by the people who are supposed to protect you, hit like and subscribe. You're not alone, and you need to hear what happened next. Growing up in the quiet, tree-lined suburbs just outside Chicago, the Millers always looked pristine from the outside. We were the kind of family neighbors nodded politely to. My parents, Evelyn and Richard, my younger brother Ethan, and me. We lived in a charming colonial home, took annual trips to Lake Michigan, and never once fretted about groceries or gas money. But behind the painted shutters and manicured lawn, our lives were far from idyllic, especially with Evelyn at the helm. She wasn't just the matriarch. She was the treasurer, the warden, the overseer of every financial breath we took. Most kids I knew had allowances to spend on candy or comic books. Mine came with spreadsheets. By age 10, I was logging every dollar spent in a little blue ledger, presenting it weekly like a report to a board of directors. Evelyn would scrutinize each line with a raised brow and the kind of condescension that could peel paint. $12 at the school book fair, Chloe, she'd ask, adjusting her half-moon glasses. Another fantasy novel? You've barely cracked open the last 10. You really think you needed it? That was her version of nurturing, and things only escalated when I got my first job, bagging groceries at Fresh Foods. The paycheck didn't mean independence, it meant more surveillance. My parents insisted I open a joint account for guidance, though it quickly became clear that guidance meant gatekeeping. Every purchase flagged, every non-essential item questioned with a sigh or a look of exaggerated disappointment. Meanwhile, Ethan, my younger brother, thrived in their system. He adopted their values like gospel, even reporting my spending habits with a sense of righteous pride. "You know Chloe bought iced coffee again," he'd say, as if catching me in a crime. They called him the financial hawk. He wore it like a badge. At 17, I discovered Evelyn had been quietly opening my mail. College packets, scholarship letters, financial aid information, all intercepted without a word. The confrontation that followed shattered what little illusion of privacy I had left. She didn't yell. She didn't need to. Her words sliced through me, flat and cold. "Higher education is a ridiculous indulgence," she said, as if discussing a frivolous shopping spree. "You'll live at home, attend the local community college, and contribute to the Cornerstone Fund. That's your duty as a Miller." The fund had always been this vaguely defined pot, allegedly for family stability, managed solely by Evelyn and Richard. Contributions weren't optional. They were expected, demanded. It felt like a trap, a life sentence dressed up as family tradition. That night, something broke inside me. I began combing through scholarship listings like my life depended on it, because it did. I picked up extra shifts, saved every tip, and opened a hidden savings account with statements mailed to Sarah's house, my best friend, my lifeline. When the acceptance letters came, I chose a university nearly 1,000 miles away in Colorado, not because I loved the school, but because the financial aid was generous and the distance offered oxygen. Telling them was like lighting a match near a powder keg. My father's face flushed an alarming shade of red. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "You're throwing away everything we've built for this family," he said, as if I were setting fire to our house. "Leave now, but don't expect us to support your selfishness." Ethan stood halfway down the stairs, stunned but loyal. "You're being completely self-absorbed," he told me later, baffled. "They only want what's best." But I had already learned. What they wanted had nothing to do with what I needed. The next morning, I left with 2 overstuffed suitcases and just enough money for used textbooks. The 4 years that followed were the hardest of my life. I juggled a full course load while working 2 jobs. One at the campus library, the other slinging pancakes and hash browns at a diner downtown. My meals were whatever fit the cheapest meal plan, plus leftovers from campus events and the occasional free pizza handed out by clubs I never joined. Holidays weren't for family anymore. They were for double shifts and time and a half pay. My parents waited for me to fail, to come crawling back, battered by life, but I didn't. I graduated with honors, a degree, and the kind of stubborn self-reliance that kept me standing. By the time I walked across that stage, I hadn't spoken a word to Evelyn or Richard in nearly 3 years. Ethan came to the ceremony, sitting stiffly in the back, phone in hand. He talked of healing, of reconnection, but always with a catch. "You just have to admit you owe the family," he said gently. "The fun still matters." I told him no, not because I didn't care, but because I finally did, about myself. As I stepped into adulthood, I carried 2 things: the heavy weight of financial solitude and the burning determination to one day own something truly mine, something no one could monitor, manipulate, or steal. What I didn't know then was how that very dream, freedom, independence, self-determination, would one day drag me right back into their world, not to reunite, but to fight. And this time, in a courtroom, against the very people I once called family. 10 years had passed, 10 long, determined years, and I had finally done it. I'd bought a home of my own. A small, unassuming bungalow in a modest Denver neighborhood, nothing grand, but wholly mine. I sent a simple email to my family, just my new address and a cheerful photo of the house. No fanfare, just an open invitation should they ever wish to visit. For Ethan, I added a longer note, softer in tone, hoping to stir something in him, perhaps a willingness to reconnect. I envisioned an awkward but civil path back toward family ties, fragile but possible. What I received instead came 3 days later, a phone call from Ethan. My heart jumped with cautious hope. It had been over 2 years since I'd heard his voice. "Ethan, it's so good to... What exactly do you think you're playing at?" His voice was frigid, controlled, brimming with restrained irritation. I just wanted to share the good news. I finally bought a house." "With what funds, Chloe?" he snapped, a scoff barely hidden behind the words. "With my savings. I've worked and saved for a decade." The laugh that followed was sharp and mocking. "Right, because entry-level marketers are snapping up houses these days. Come on, Chloe, let's be realistic." I started to explain about the long hours, the multiple promotions, the freelance gigs. But he wasn't listening. He cut in, brisk and final. "Mom and Dad expect you this Sunday. Dinner's at 6. Don't be late." Then he hung up. No room for discussion, no sign of warmth. Just a command. That Sunday, I made the drive. 2 long hours from Denver back to the place I once called home. Everything looked the same. The carefully trimmed hedges, the beige siding, the chipped ceramic welcome sign Evelyn had painted in another lifetime. Richard opened the door, looking older, a bit more tired, but no less stern. "Chloe," he said flatly, as though reading my name from a file. No hug, no smile, not even a handshake, just the bare minimum. Inside, Evelyn was fussing with the special china, the kind reserved for holidays. Ethan and his wife, Clara, sat uncomfortably on the living room couch, polite but distant. No one met my eyes for long. Dinner felt less like a homecoming and more like a courtroom recess, tense, formal, loaded. Clara tried to break the ice with small talk about the weather, her voice wavering. When Evelyn brought out apple pie, my childhood favorite, I dared to hope for one foolish moment that maybe things were changing. Maybe the door wasn't completely shut. But as I took a bite, Richard cleared his throat. "So, Chloe," he began, tone carefully neutral, "tell us about this house of yours." I described it cautiously, talked about the neighborhood, the little yard, the work I planned to do. "And how much did it cost?" Evelyn asked, fork poised midair like a dagger. $282,000, I answered truthfully. Richard narrowed his eyes. "That's a rather significant amount. You're saying you managed that entirely on your own?" "Yes," I replied. "I've worked hard, saved relentlessly. It's been far from easy." Evelyn placed her fork down with a decisive clink, her lips thin with skepticism. "Don't insult our intelligence, Chloe. Not with your starting salary and those student loans dragging behind you like anchors." "I've climbed the ladder. Promotions, freelance clients, night shifts, you name it. I have records if you'd like to see." Richard leaned in, voice low and unnerving. "We don't need proof. What we see is someone who's clearly misappropriated what rightfully belongs to the family." My breath caught in my chest. I'm sorry, what are you suggesting? I haven't taken a cent from anyone. Evelyn gave a dry, humorless chuckle. Oh, but you have, darling. 10 years of not contributing to the Cornerstone Fund. 10 years of hoarding what should have been shared. And now you flaunt that selfishness with a house? How tasteful. I stared at them, trying to absorb what I was hearing. The Cornerstone Fund? I haven't lived under your roof since I left for college. I've paid for everything on my own. That's not how family works, Richard said, each word measured like a judge handing down a sentence. Everyone contributes. Everyone benefits. Ethan, for example, has dutifully given 30% of his income since he started working. That fund was built for all of us, including you, eventually. But no one ever told me what it was for, I exclaimed, trying to stay calm. And I've managed my life without ever asking for help. And that, Evelyn interjected sharply, was your choice. But obligations don't vanish just because you decided to play martyr. Based on your projected earnings over the last 10 years, we estimate your outstanding contribution to be around $95,000. I felt like the floor had vanished beneath me. You expect me to hand over $95,000. For what? To buy back your approval? To fulfill your role, Richard said coldly. To make amends. To show you understand what it means to be part of this family. Ethan finally broke his silence, lifting his eyes at last. There was no anger in his expression, just a deep, familiar disappointment that felt like a slow-acting poison. His wife, Clara, said nothing, her gaze fixed on her untouched plate like it might offer an escape. Clara and I have chosen to delay having children, Ethan said, his voice low but loaded with judgment. We've put off buying our own home because we've made responsible financial choices. We've honored the family commitment. Meanwhile, you've apparently been stockpiling your earnings for personal gain. That's not what shared sacrifice looks like. My restraint crumbled. That's not fair, I cried, louder than I intended. You think this was easy? I worked 3 jobs at one point. I lived in a shoebox with 3 roommates and lived off stale cereal and instant noodles for years. Every dollar I saved came at the cost of something else. Richard cut in, unmoved. Then now is your opportunity to make it right, he said flatly, almost bored. You will sell the house, repay the amount owed to the Cornerstone Fund, and we can all put this unpleasant episode behind us. I shot to my feet, my chair crashing to the floor. Absolutely not. That house is mine. Every cent that paid for it came from years of sacrifice you wouldn't last a week enduring. Evelyn's expression grew colder than stone. Then you leave us no choice. Her words fell like a final verdict. 2 weeks later, a knock at the door broke the fragile peace of my new home. A courier handed me a thick envelope, legal documents. I tore them open with trembling hands, heart pounding. My parents, Evelyn and Richard Miller, were suing me for $95,000. Their accusations? Misuse of family funds and violation of unspoken financial obligations. They were demanding the court place a lien on my home until I surrendered what they deemed theirs. I sank onto my second-hand sofa, barely able to breathe. This wasn't just rejection. This was betrayal in its rawest form, strategic, deliberate, and cruel. They weren't cutting me off. They were coming for what I had bled for. The next morning, I called in sick to work, something I had never once done in my professional life. I sat at my kitchen table, laptop open, diving into a legal world I never imagined I'd need to navigate. Terms like constructive trust and implied contract blurred on the screen, each one tightening the knot of panic in my chest. Could they really do this? Could a decade of scraping by be undone by legal jargon and emotional manipulation? By noon, I knew one thing for certain. I needed help. Real professional help. I couldn't afford a high-powered attorney, but I couldn't afford to lose the house either. I spent the afternoon calling law firms, 8 to be exact. Each call met with confusion or outright skepticism. Eventually, I found David Chen, a family attorney who offered a free consultation. His office was modest and cluttered, much like the man himself. His suit wrinkled, his tie slightly askew. But there was a clarity in his eyes that gave me a flicker of hope. He listened quietly as I recounted everything, skimming the lawsuit with practiced speed. Well, he said, brows knitting, this is unorthodox to say the least. Is it even legal? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. They haven't given me a cent since I was 18. How could they claim I owe them anything? David leaned back, fingers steepled. They're relying on something called a constructive trust, Essentially, they're saying there was an unspoken agreement, an expectation that you'd contribute to this family fund. Their argument is that the financial discipline, the structure they instilled in you, gave you the foundation to succeed, and that now you owe them for it. I stared at him, stunned. That's just parenting. That's what they were supposed to do. David nodded. You're not wrong, but unfortunately, courts sometimes entertain arguments like this, especially when they're dressed in the language of implied obligation. The good news? Their case leans heavily on emotional rhetoric, not solid legal footing. The bad news? It's going to cost you to prove that. His retainer was $3,500. It was money I had reserved to paint the chipped siding of my new home, my small, proud investment in a future I'd fought tooth and nail to build. I wrote the check with shaking hands. It was the first major expense I hadn't planned in over 10 years, and it felt like someone had reached inside me and ripped out the breath I'd been holding. But I had no choice. In the weeks that followed, David and I worked with methodical precision, leaving no stone unturned. We compiled every financial document I had, decade-old tax returns, pay stubs from 3 different jobs, and detailed bank statements tracing every cent I'd managed to save. I contacted Leo, my former roommate, who agreed without hesitation to testify about the years we lived like sardines to make rent. Mr. Henderson, my first manager at Summit Marketing, confirmed I had consistently juggled multiple jobs and often volunteered for the shifts no one else wanted. Even the college financial aid office provided a letter clearly stating I had received 0 parental assistance throughout my entire academic career. And yet, while I tried to fortify my defense, the weight of the lawsuit began to consume every corner of my life like a creeping fog. I couldn't sleep. Nightmares of foreclosure and homelessness startled me awake at 3 a.m. I shed pounds I couldn't afford to lose, my frame growing noticeably gaunt. My coworkers noticed the change in me, but how could I explain that my parents weren't just estranged? They were now my adversaries in court. 6 weeks after the legal ambush arrived at my door, the first court appearance loomed. It was only a preliminary hearing, but my heart pounded like I was walking to the gallows. Outside the courtroom, I saw them, my parents and Ethan, seated on a bench in the hallway, looking poised and polished. Evelyn wore her finest conservative dress, her signature pearls resting like armor against her collarbone. Richard, in the same charcoal suit he wore to funerals and weddings, sat with his hands folded and face blank. They looked for all the world like a concerned, upright family dragged into an unfortunate misunderstanding. Not one of them looked my way as I walked by. Their indifference was colder than any outburst. Inside, their attorney, Arthur Maxwell, took command of the room with the confidence of someone who'd played this part many times. He was crisply dressed, measured in tone, and clearly well-versed in theatrics. Maxwell's voice carried as he addressed Judge Harrison, a sharp-eyed woman who studied everything without ever revealing what she was thinking. Your Honor, the Millers have a long-standing family tradition known as the Cornerstone Fund, he began smoothly, almost warmly. Both children were made aware of its purpose from adolescence. Ethan Miller has dutifully fulfilled his financial commitment, while Ms. Miller, despite having reaped the benefits of their support, structure, and moral guidance, has deliberately opted out, amassing personal wealth behind their backs. He even added a pause, as if the weight of my betrayal spoke for itself. This is not merely about money, it's about a shared understanding, a family code, one she now denies ever existed. Judge Harrison turned to me with a penetrating look. Miss Miller, you dispute that any such agreement was ever made. David stepped forward before I could respond, calm and prepared. Your Honor, while my client does not deny the term Cornerstone Fund was mentioned in passing during her teen years, she firmly asserts that there was never a formal or even implied agreement to contribute. Furthermore, Ms. Miller became financially independent at the age of 18 and has received no monetary support from her parents since. Her ability to save was the result of strenuous labor, working up to 3 jobs simultaneously, and living in substandard housing for years. This wasn't privilege, it was grit. The judge flipped through the documents David had submitted, her eyes scanning quickly. You claim you saved over $350,000 while holding mostly entry-level roles during that period? Her tone wasn't skeptical, just searching. Yes, Your Honor, I replied steadily, surprising myself with how strong my voice sounded. I have documentation for every cent. I never took a dime from anyone else, not once. Judge Harrison gave no indication of what she believed, only a soft, unreadable nod. "Remarkable, if accurate," she murmured. Then she turned to Maxwell. "And do you have any evidence that proves a binding agreement beyond the family's verbal interpretation?" Unfazed, Maxwell produced a series of exhibits with an almost theatrical flourish. Birthday cards I'd sent with generic notes like, "Thinking of you." An old high school essay on financial literacy that had nothing to do with the family fund. Photographs from holidays meant to convey closeness, unity. "These materials," he said with practiced gravitas, "illustrate a household of shared values and mutual expectations, the very foundation of this fund." I stared in disbelief. This was their evidence? Warm wishes in a greeting card? A class assignment? But Judge Harrison didn't flinch. She took it all in without a flicker of emotion. "This matter warrants a full hearing," she said finally, her voice firm. "We will reconvene next month for further examination. In the meantime, I will not authorize any lien to be placed on Miss Miller's property. However, she is expressly prohibited from selling or refinancing it until the case is resolved." My knees nearly buckled. For now, at least, my home was safe, but nothing felt secure. As we gathered our things, I glanced one last time at my family across the courtroom. They didn't look angry. They looked patient, as if they knew this wasn't over. "Round one goes to us," David whispered, slipping the documents back into his worn leather briefcase. "But they're going to regroup. I'd bet good money they'll start contacting your former roommates, co-workers, maybe even professors. Anyone who might have heard you say something that can be twisted into a financial promise." I nodded slowly. He was absolutely right. They hadn't come this far to walk away. The next several weeks blurred into a marathon of legal preparation and mounting anxiety. I took unpaid leave from my job to assist David with assembling our case, an agonizing decision that left my already fragile finances even more threadbare. We doubled down on our efforts, gathering solid, irrefutable documentation, glowing recommendation letters from past employers vouching for my relentless work ethic, formal statements from university officials affirming without hesitation that I had never received a cent from my parents, even folders of receipts cataloging years of modest, penny-pinching habits, $10 takeout splurges, thrift store coats, shared utilities split 4 ways. Meanwhile, Arthur Maxwell, the Millers' ever-confident attorney, continued his campaign of intimidation, sending aggressive requests for increasingly absurd evidence. At one point, he demanded access to my childhood journals and any correspondence where I might have casually referenced the so-called Cornerstone Fund. David calmly dismissed most of it as legal posturing and handled each response with expert precision. 2 days before the hearing, my phone buzzed with a message from Ethan, a message that chilled me more than any letter from a lawyer ever could. "It's not too late, Chloe," it read. "Sell the house, pay what you owe, we can be a family again, just like it's meant to be." I stared at the screen for a long time. No anger, no pleading, just a quiet conditional offer with strings tightly knotted around it. I didn't reply. I couldn't. The morning of the hearing came with a lead weight in my gut. I couldn't eat, couldn't even sip coffee. I pulled on my navy sheath dress, the same one I'd bought secondhand years ago, reserved for big meetings that mattered, and stepped out the door, holding my breath. The courtroom felt noticeably fuller this time. My parents had brought an entourage, familiar faces curated carefully to impress. There was Aunt Carol, always quick to support Richard and Evelyn no matter the situation. Pastor Davies sat near the front, radiating a calm sort of condemnation behind polite eyes. And the Reynolds, our old neighbors, looked on with strained sympathy, as though mourning a wayward child. On my side sat Leo, my former roommate, and Sarah, my fiercest supporter. Mr. Henderson, my old boss, had also made the trip, seated quietly but solidly behind me. The contrast wasn't lost on me. Blood on one side, chosen family on the other, one built by obligation, the other by love and loyalty. The hearing opened with my parents' testimony. Richard spoke first, his tone deliberate, rehearsed. He outlined what he called our family's financial values, claiming they were clearly explained to both children, from adolescence onward. "In our household," he stated, eyes forward, "we emphasize that resources should serve the collective." Chloe was no stranger to this principle. She simply abandoned it the moment it became inconvenient. Next was Evelyn, who played her part with trembling voice and carefully timed dabs at her eyes. She spoke of the sacrifices they made for my future, the financial discipline they so generously instilled, and the heartache of watching her own daughter turn her back on everything she was taught. "All we ask is fairness," she said, her voice cracking at just the right moment. "Ethan and Clara have waited to start a family. They've honored their share. Chloe should do the same." Then Maxwell presented his exhibits, enlarged photos of family dinners, holiday gatherings, my high school graduation, moments frozen in time, carefully selected to evoke a Norman Rockwell image of familial unity. He contrasted Ethan's organized, consistent contributions to the fund with what he called my complete disengagement, as if frugality and financial independence were sins to be confessed. When it was finally our turn, David approached the witness stand with steady poise. "Mrs. Miller," he began with quiet confidence, "you've made it clear that you believe Chloe is indebted to the family because of the support she received growing up. Is that accurate?" "Yes," Evelyn replied, shifting slightly in her seat. "We gave her every opportunity." "And would you agree," David continued smoothly, "that basic food, housing, education, and parental care are legally required responsibilities, not privileges?" Evelyn blinked. "Well, yes, but that's hardly the point." "So then, to clarify," David said, his tone still respectful, "you're asking the court to compel your adult daughter to financially compensate you for fulfilling your basic legal duties as parents?" "That's a gross mischaracterization," she snapped, cheeks flushed. "No further questions on that point, Your Honor," David concluded, turning to Richard without missing a beat. "Mr. Miller," David began calmly, standing before the witness stand, "did you, at any point during Chloe's entire college experience, offer her any direct financial assistance?" Richard's jaw tensed as he gave his rehearsed response. "She opted to attend an excessively costly out-of-state university, despite our repeated objections. Had she followed the financial plan we carefully laid out for her, we would have supported her, but she insisted on doing things her own way." David raised a brow. "So for the record, that's a no?" He let the silence linger just long enough to press the point. "And since she graduated, Mr. Miller, have you helped her financially in any way? Housing, medical bills, car payments, living expenses?" Richard gave a tight shrug. "No, but—" "Thank you, Mr. Miller. That's all I needed to clarify," David said smoothly, stepping back. Leo, my old roommate, took the stand next. He painted a vivid picture of our lives in that dingy Denver apartment. My 9-by-7-foot room, barely big enough for a twin bed. The shared bathroom, always a little grimy, and the perpetual scent of someone's half-burned dinner wafting from the communal kitchen. Chloe never ordered takeout, never bought herself anything new. She lived like someone in survival mode, Leo explained, shaking his head. Honestly, we worried about her. There were no nights out, no celebrations, just work and saving, on repeat. That was her entire life. Then came Mr. Henderson, my former boss at Summit Marketing. His words were few, but carried undeniable weight. Chloe was always the first to raise her hand for overtime. She handled the tedious tasks no one else wanted, just for the extra pay. I'd often find her skipping lunch, staying late, never asking for compensation. Her drive was different. She was determined in a way I rarely see in someone so young. When it was my turn, I walked to the witness stand with a strange, settled composure. The whirlwind of pain, shock, and betrayal had slowly hardened into something solid. Conviction. David stood beside me, his voice steady. "Ms. Miller, can you walk the court through how you managed to save enough to purchase your home?" I laid it all out. The years of juggling jobs, the constant hunt for cheaper housing. The meals that consisted of instant noodles and half-price groceries. I explained how I'd built a budgeting system that siphoned savings before I could even see my paycheck. I spoke of each promotion, earned not by luck but by endurance, by giving more than was ever expected. "And during those 10 years, did you ever receive any financial help from your parents?" "None," I said without hesitation. "From the moment I left home at 18, I was on my own." "And was there ever a binding, mutual agreement that you were obligated to contribute to the Cornerstone Fund?" "No. It was something they spoke about as an expectation, but I never agreed. And once I deviated from their chosen path, they made it painfully clear. Support was off the table." Arthur Maxwell rose for cross-examination, all cool confidence and thinly veiled condescension. He paced slowly, pausing for effect. "Ms. Miller, would you not agree?" he asked with a smug smirk. That the financial discipline you claim led to your impressive savings was, in fact, a direct result of your upbringing, that your parents instilled those values in you from a young age? I took a breath, choosing my words with precision. The kind of discipline my parents taught was rooted in surveillance, not self-reliance. What I learned growing up was control. Every cent questioned, every decision second-guessed. I turned to meet his eyes directly. What I did, working multiple jobs, living in subpar conditions, choosing sacrifice over comfort for 10 straight years, none of that came from their guidance. That I taught myself because I had no other choice. A soft murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even those seated behind my parents shifted uneasily. My words, shaped by years of silence, finally landed in a space where they could no longer be ignored. The turning point, the exact moment when the scales began to tip, came during Evelyn's second round of testimony. Attempting to bolster their increasingly fragile narrative, she delivered what would ultimately become a critical, self-inflicted blow. "Chloe has always been reckless with money," she exclaimed, her voice pitched with irritation. "Back in college, she was constantly reaching out to us for help. Always one emergency after another. We stepped in countless times. That was all David needed." His calm professionalism gave way to a quiet, razor-sharp intensity. "Mrs. Miller," he said, locking eyes with her, "you previously testified under oath that you provided zero financial assistance to your daughter during college. Now you're asserting the exact opposite. So which sworn statement is true?" Evelyn's face blanched. Her eyes darted toward Arthur Maxwell, her polished composure slipping fast. "Well, I suppose there may have been a few small loans. Nothing substantial," she murmured, flustered. "Do you have any proof of these loans?" David continued, not letting up. "Receipts, bank transfers, signed agreements?" Evelyn looked away. "It was all in cash. Weekly, maybe. We're family. We don't keep paperwork for helping our own." "Understood," David said smoothly, turning back toward the bench. "No further questions, Your Honor." He returned to his seat beside me with the faintest, satisfied smile. For the first time in months, something stirred inside me. Hope. Not yet victory, but the possibility of it. When the time came for Judge Harrison to deliver her decision, her face remained unreadable, a mask of judicial discipline. She methodically reviewed the record, the evidence from both sides, the inconsistencies in Evelyn's and Richard's sworn testimony, and the mountain of documented proof of my self-sufficiency and financial independence. The room fell into a hush, every breath collectively held. "This court finds no credible or enforceable evidence of a legal agreement requiring Ms. Chloe Miller to contribute to her parents' so-called Cornerstone Fund," Judge Harrison stated clearly, her tone firm and unambiguous. "The funds in question were earned solely by Ms. Miller through her own labor, without any material support from her parents. Therefore, the plaintiff's claim is hereby dismissed in full." Then she turned directly to Evelyn and Richard. Her expression sharpened, but her voice remained steady. "While families may hold their own internal expectations or unwritten codes of conduct, the court does not and cannot enforce vague, emotionally driven beliefs that have no legal foundation." The record suggests this was less about mutual support than about asserting control. With that, her gavel struck the bench, a single resounding crack that signaled not just the case's conclusion, but the final collapse of what little family connection still lingered between us. The moments that followed passed in a haze. David turned to me, offering a firm handshake and an uncharacteristically wide grin. "Well done, Chloe. Your home is safe." I smiled back faintly, though what I felt wasn't triumph. It was something quieter, emptier. I looked across the aisle at my parents. Evelyn sat hunched over, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders trembling. Richard sat rigid beside her, his arm resting awkwardly on her back, his face an unreadable wall. Ethan stood a few feet away, speaking in low tones to Arthur Maxwell, occasionally throwing sharp glances in my direction. As I began gathering our files, a court officer approached and spoke gently. "Ms. Miller will be escorting your family out through a separate exit to avoid any further interaction. You're free to leave through the main doors in about 10 minutes. I gave him a grateful nod, surprised by his consideration. I hadn't even thought to ask. David helped me pack the thick folders and exhibits into my weathered messenger bag, offering practical guidance as we worked. "We'll get the judgment officially recorded with the property clerk," he said. Then we can file the appropriate notice so your title is fully protected. Just a few final steps, and this chapter will be legally closed. Will they appeal? I asked softly, my voice quivering despite myself. David glanced at me reassuringly, his response calm but firm. They might attempt it, but they have no legal standing. The judge's ruling was crystal clear. This case is closed, Chloe. You've won. And yet, standing in that silent courtroom, victory felt far more hollow than I'd ever imagined. As I waited for my parents to be escorted out, I remained alone on the wooden bench, the weight of everything finally crashing over me. I had just faced my own flesh and blood in a court of law, and not over a misunderstanding, but over an orchestrated attempt to take from me the one thing I had worked so relentlessly to achieve. In doing so, I had laid bare years of dysfunction, control, and emotional withholding. There would be no warm reunions, no Sunday dinners around my kitchen table, no healing where there had never truly been an open wound, only a scar that had grown deeper over time. When I finally stepped out into the sharp afternoon light, it felt like I was emerging from one world into another. I breathed deeply, tasting both freedom and finality. The courthouse doors closed behind me with a heavy thunk. The legal storm was over, but in its wake was a grief I couldn't quite name. I had survived, but not unchanged. I had protected what was mine, but the cost wasn't just legal, it was personal. I had made peace with the loss of something that had never been whole. And yet, just as I reached the edge of the parking lot, I heard hurried footsteps behind me. "Chloe, wait!" Ethan's voice cut through the air, sharp and urgent. I turned instinctively, my body tensing at the sound. He came to a halt just feet from me, his face flushed with either anger or the effort of chasing me down. "How could you do this to them?" he demanded, his voice brimming with disbelief. "Do you have any idea how humiliating this has been? The shame you've put them through?" His words struck like tiny darts, full of accusation wrapped in confusion. I looked at him, at the brother I had once shared childhood secrets with. Now a stranger cloaked in misplaced loyalty. For a moment, a flicker of doubt surfaced. Had I gone too far? But then I remembered it all. The holidays I spent alone, the dinners skipped to save grocery money, the roommates, the night shifts, the tears I swallowed down while others built careers and families. And finally, the betrayal, the lawsuit that had tried to claim a decade of sacrifice with the stroke of a pen. "How could I echoed, steadying my breath. How could they file suit against their daughter to claim money she earned herself? And how could you support them?" "It was never just about the money," Ethan insisted, lowering his voice slightly as people passed us on the courthouse steps, casting quick glances. "It's about loyalty. Family should come before individual ambition. That's what this was really about." "No, Ethan," I said quietly, shaking my head. "This was always about control, dressed up as loyalty. You just never saw it." He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture I knew too well. "You think you're above all of us, so independent, so clever, but one day you'll be alone in that house you fought so hard for. And when that happens, who will be there for you? Who's going to care?" His words landed with painful precision, hitting the fear I had wrestled with in silence for years. But I wasn't that woman anymore. "I know exactly who," I replied, voice calm. "The people who love me without strings attached. The friends who stood by me while you kept score. That's the family I've built, Ethan, while you were too busy playing the perfect son for people who never loved without conditions." Ethan recoiled slightly, as if I'd physically pushed him. His expression hardened. "They were right about you. You're not just selfish. You're cruel." "I'm sorry you feel that way," I said, and I meant it. "But if you ever want a relationship that isn't filtered through mom and dad's rules, my door is open. I won't apologize for building a life that's mine alone." He didn't reply. He turned and walked briskly toward the lot, where I imagined Evelyn and Richard were waiting with the engine running. I watched him disappear, his footsteps echoing on the pavement. With each step he took, the final thread binding me to my biological family unraveled, silent and irrevocable. That evening, I found myself sitting cross-legged on the hardwood floor of my living room, surrounded by the handful of furnishings I had gathered piece by piece, each one purchased with care, each one a quiet symbol of independence. The court ruling had gone in my favor, and yet the emotional toll lingered like a shadow stretching across the room. I had defended my right to keep what I had spent years sacrificing to earn, but I had also closed the door, perhaps permanently, on any illusion of healing within my biological family. That truth sat heavy in my chest. I picked up my phone and dialed Sarah. When she answered, I didn't wait. "It's done," I whispered, my voice tight with the strange mix of relief and sorrow. "I won." Her response came quickly, her voice dancing with real joy. "Oh my God, Chloe, that's incredible! You did it! This calls for celebration. I'm bringing champagne. None of that bargain bin stuff either. I'm talking the real deal." I laughed softly for the first time in what felt like months, surprised by the sound of it. "Could you bring those friends you told me about? The ones who know their way around a paintbrush? I think it's finally time to turn this house into something more than just four walls. I think it's time to make it feel like mine." There was a long pause, and then she said with quiet certainty, "We'll be there." 2 hours later, the living room that had once echoed with silence now buzzed with warm laughter and the scent of fresh pizza. Sarah arrived with 4 friends in tow, people I'd never met, but who greeted me like they'd known me for years. They brought brushes, paint trays, music, and energy that filled every inch of the space. We got to work on the hallway, rolling soft sage green across the walls, a color I had picked out months ago, back when this house still felt temporary. As the layers of paint dried, something shifted within me too. Not just a wall transformed, but a space becoming a reflection of who I was, not who I had been told to be. Somewhere between the second coat and the shared stories over paper plates, I felt it, belonging. And it didn't come from bloodlines or shared last names. It came from kindness freely given, from presence without expectation, from people who saw me not as an obligation, but as a person worth showing up for. In that moment, it became crystal clear. Family isn't always the people you're born into. Sometimes, it's the ones you invite in, the ones who meet you halfway. And perhaps more importantly, the ones who choose to stay. In the weeks that followed the court's decision, a peculiar mix of calm and quiet sorrow began to take root. With the legal storm finally behind me, I could, perhaps for the first time in my adult life, devote my energy entirely to making my house a real home. Each room was painted with care, the colors chosen after hours of research, a balance between soothing stillness and quiet joy. I combed secondhand shops and clearance aisles, hunting for pieces that did more than serve a function. They reflected who I was becoming. Slowly but surely, this bungalow, once just a refuge, began to transform into something far more. A personal sanctuary built not just on sacrifice, but on steadfast resolve and hard-won independence. And yet the emotional debris left behind from the courtroom lingered quietly in the background. I still jolted awake in the middle of the night, heart pounding, chased by dreams of courtroom walls and echoing voices. My parents' criticisms reverberating like a refrain I couldn't shake. My fingers would reach for my phone before I could stop them, scanning for a message from Ethan. A peace offering, perhaps, or even a simple acknowledgement. But my screen remained silent. Sarah, always intuitive, noticed something was still unsettled during one of our weekly dinners. Simple, rotating meals that had become a new ritual among friends. While drying dishes, she gave me a quiet look. "You may have won the case, Chloe," she said gently, "but it feels like you're still stuck in the fight. Have you ever thought about speaking with someone? A therapist?" I'd resisted the suggestion at first. Therapy had always seemed like a luxury I couldn't afford, especially after years of internalizing the message that personal needs should come last. But no amount of paint swatches or throw pillows could patch the hole that court victory had left behind. Eventually, I found Dr. Elaine Peterson, a local therapist offering sliding scale sessions. From the very first meeting, she offered something I hadn't realized I needed: language for what I was feeling. Estrangement from family, she explained gently, is a form of grief that doesn't always come with sympathy. You're mourning not just what was lost, but what was never truly there. The dream of the family you hoped for, not the one you actually had. Our sessions became weekly landmarks, places where I could finally give shape to years of pain I had packed away while chasing financial survival. I had thought I was saving for freedom, but in truth, I was also building walls, fortresses to keep out the emotional strings that had always been attached to the Miller's version of love. Dr. Peterson helped me see that what my parents had claimed as concern had often been coercion disguised as care. They weren't fixated on the money, she observed during one session. They were invested in what money allowed them to control: your choices, your voice, your life. The moment you broke free, they used that same tool to try and drag you back. "But why do I still feel like I've done something terribly wrong?" I asked her once, my voice smaller than I meant it to be. Like I stole something when I know I didn't. She looked at me with quiet understanding. "Because that guilt was planted in you early and reinforced for years. You were trained to believe that independence was betrayal. And even when we outgrow that system, the emotional echoes remain. That guilt doesn't mean you've done wrong. It means you were taught to feel that way when you dared to choose yourself." While therapy helped untangle the knots inside me, I also began to rebuild outward. The friends who had stood beside me during the court ordeal became more than just a support system. They became family in the truest sense of the word. We started a monthly dinner circle, rotating homes, sharing stories over roasted vegetables and second helpings of dessert. I signed up for a plot at a community garden a few blocks away, not expecting much. But something changed the first time I pulled weeds from the soil and planted my first tomato seedlings. There was a peace in that rhythm, intending to something and watching it thrive. No strings, no expectations, just quiet growth. 6 months after the court ruling, just when I had begun settling into a rhythm of peace, an unexpected message lit up my phone. "Can we talk?" It was from Ethan. We met at a quiet cafe halfway between our homes. Neutral ground for a conversation long overdue. The exchange was strained at first, thick with the weight of unspoken pain and unresolved history. Yet amidst the stiffness and awkward pauses, there was something else too, a fragile willingness to begin again. "I'm not saying Mom and Dad were right," he said, eyes fixed on the swirl of his coffee. "But I don't think you realize how much your leaving shifted everything, for all of us." I answered carefully. "I didn't walk away from the family, Ethan. I walked away from their grip. And there's a difference, an important one." He didn't acknowledge it, but he didn't push back either. Before parting, we agreed to meet again the next month. It wasn't resolution, but it was a beginning. As for my parents, they remained distant, unyielding in silence. Through Ethan, I learned they had quietly told the extended family that I had experienced vague legal trouble, conveniently skipping over the fact that they themselves were the plaintiffs in a failed lawsuit. Their version of the story had been rewritten, polished to protect their reputation, with me cast in the role of the troubled child who had drifted away. It hurt more than I liked to admit, but with Dr. Peterson's continued guidance, I was learning to let go of their narrative. "You don't get to control what they tell others," she reminded me gently, "but you do get to live your truth. And eventually, the truth speaks louder than the stories others tell." And indeed, my life began to speak volumes. A year after the trial, I earned a major promotion at Global Insights, recognizing not just my work ethic, but the quiet leadership I had cultivated through endurance. My bungalow, once my battleground, was rising in value as the neighborhood continued to flourish. More importantly, I launched something called the Freedom Fund, a small grant program to help others trying to escape controlling financial entanglements. It wasn't grand in scale, but it was real, and it was mine. A small, tangible way to give others the very lifeline I had once so desperately needed. But the most profound shift didn't appear in my title or bank account. It was internal. The fear-driven frugality that had ruled my life for a decade began to loosen its grip. I slowly gave myself permission to enjoy life, really enjoy it, without guilt shadowing every indulgence. A well-prepared meal at a nice restaurant after a win at work. A spontaneous weekend at the lake with Sarah and our circle. Fresh tulips for my kitchen table, for no reason other than they made me smile. True financial independence, I reflected aloud to Dr. Peterson one day, isn't just about dollars in an account. It's the freedom to use what I've earned in a way that honors my values, not anyone else's expectations. 18 months after the trial, Ethan and Clara welcomed their first child, a beautiful baby girl named Lily. I received the birth announcement alongside an invitation to meet my new niece. I said yes with a complicated mix of joy and apprehension. Standing in their modest apartment, cradling the tiny bundle swaddled in pastel cotton, I felt something shift, softly, tentatively. Ethan and I had spent the last year building a different kind of connection, one with clearly drawn lines, especially around money and our parents. It was delicate but real. "She has your nose," I joked gently. Poor thing, he replied with a smirk. Just like the brother I remembered before expectations and silence came between us. My parents, though, remained unchanged. I sent them a simple card announcing Lily's birth. No bitterness, just shared joy. They didn't write back. But the card wasn't returned either. A tiny, nearly invisible crack in the stone wall between us. A sliver of possibility that perhaps one day, a little more light might find its way through. 2 years to the day after I bought the bungalow, I threw an anniversary gathering. Friends, the ones who had shown up when things were at their darkest, filled the backyard I had slowly transformed into the garden of my dreams. Lavender and tomatoes, sunflowers and sage lined the fence. As we passed dishes and laughter under string lights, I looked around and saw not just a party, but a portrait of the life I had painstakingly built. Sarah raised her glass and spoke the words I would carry with me forever. To Chloe, who proved that home isn't just something you buy, it's something you build, with courage, perseverance, and the kind of love that doesn't come with conditions. Later that night, long after the last guest had gone, I sat alone on the porch swing, an early birthday gift from my circle. I rocked gently, surrounded by the soft hum of summer crickets and the scent of basil from the garden. I reflected on the winding path that had brought me here, the decade of sacrifice, the public fight for my autonomy, the slow, sometimes painful work of unlearning shame and choosing joy. What surprised me most wasn't how hard it had been to earn and defend my independence. It was realizing that the people who should love you most can sometimes be the very ones you must create the firmest boundaries with to protect who you're becoming. And in the end, what I owned wasn't just a house, it was freedom, the kind no one could take, manipulate, or control. A freedom rooted not in rebellion, but in clarity. A space that sheltered not just my body, but my whole self, finally seen, finally safe. Have you ever had to push back against family pressure just to walk your own path? To define success and joy in a way that made sense only to you? I'd be honored to hear your stories in the comments below. And if this story resonated, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who may need to hear that setting healthy boundaries, even with family, isn't betrayal. It's self-respect. Because sometimes the truest family isn't the one you're born into, it's the one you grow into, and the one that grows with you.